to Nutrition Tactics Talk 6. My name is Jorn Trommelen. I'm here with Alejandra Monzik, Milan Betts, and Cas Fuchs. And today we're going to talk about sports drinks. So, very quickly, what is a sports drink? Almost anything can classify as a sports drink. But when I think of sports drinks, I mostly think of like Gatorade. So what's in there? Well, it's fluid, obviously, a little bit of electrolytes and some carbohydrates. Those are like the main ingredients. Of course, you have all kinds of other sport drinks, protein shakes, and well, anything you can think of. Maybe we'll cover those at the end, but the focus now is mostly on drinks like Gatorade. So let's start there. Any of you ever had a Gatorade or something similar?
Yes. AA drink.
Also.
That's a Dutch one.
Yeah, I was just wondering. That's, I think, just in the Netherlands or not?
Yeah.
Or maybe
I think
Belgium
it
as
is.
well.
And do you even know what the AA stands for? Because I had no clue until like a year ago.
Something with active, I think, or not?
I think it's called after activity.
Ah,
Really?
yeah, that's correct. I think you're right.
But like no one knows.
But
Yeah,
then
I once looked that up as well a long time ago. I think you're right.
that means you take it after activity, I guess. So you don't take it during sports, not before sports. Like, I guess those are topics that we'll address today. But so is your favorite, or is just because it's a Dutch one?
Now, I mean, back in the day when I was competing in track and field, I used to always get like a AA drink with me, like on a competition day. I mean, I don't really think I needed it because I was either throwing like a discus or javelin, or I was sprinting like 100 meter. So if I look back at it, I probably didn't need it really, but I did like just the taste, and I felt like I had some more energy.
Okay, so that already raises a new topic. Like maybe you need it for some kind of sports, but not for other types of sports. But it's funny that you took the after activity drink during sports, but
I didn't know back then, so.
But yeah, I don't know if it's good or bad marketing. And you, Floof, any drinks?
No, I only drink stuff like Gatorade when I'm sick, actually.
Oh, why? What's
Well, yeah, if I'm sick and like throwing up and stuff, then yeah, I was always told that you should drink them for the electrolytes that you're losing and stuff.
Okay. Well, I now envision crazy hangovers and stuff that if you're worrying about your electrodes while electrolytes while throwing over them.
I think you're gonna go to the supermarket for next Friday to buy a
I
stack.
think it's going to be hopefully not necessary this year.
What's next Friday, Cas?
Best time of the year in the south of the Netherlands, right? Carnival.
So
I heard today, Jorn, that you're also gonna join.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. What's Carnival, Cas?
Carnival, I think most people actually know what Carnival is because it's also popular in like Venice and in Brazil and stuff. But in the south of the Netherlands, and I think also I'm sure in a specific part in Germany and also in Belgium, they celebrate this. Yeah, I mean, to be completely honest, don't ask me about the whole history behind it because I just know it as like 5 days in a row of going crazy. Just drink a lot and have fun. And I mean, I'm not a big fan of the music, but like the partying and everything is quite fun. So basically 5 days at almost everything is allowed. And people are like drunk on the streets and like during the afternoon and stuff like that, which may sound crazy and weird if you're not used to it, but it's actually quite fun.
Yeah, I always explain it as just 5 days of Halloween, not one day, but 5 days. All right, so I guess we'll have to get into the topic at some point. So
You're not even gonna ask me what my favorite drink was when I was younger. I
you
was
do
waiting for this the whole time.
you do
I wasn't really
sports.
thinking about it.
No, go ahead. Now I
Aqua-
expect a massive story.
No, just I wanted to say that I liked Aquarius when I was playing.
Yeah, of course.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Good, nice.
But so what did you like about it? Like, did you like the bottle, the taste, or were you like, wow, best ingredients?
The taste, but I mean, this is a long time ago. I haven't drank Aquarius in a long time actually. But when I was younger, and I was playing football. I always liked the Aquarius for the taste, but also the bottle is actually quite cool as well. To be honest.
What's cool about it?
I love
I don't know.
how all these high-level researchers like fall for all the marketing, like go crazy about the name of the drink and the bottle. But okay, so I hear soccer. So Milan looking back is like, not sure if I needed it. You looking back, like, could sport drinks have some purpose in soccer or?
I know that probably not back then. I was young. I was eating my meals. I think at that age it's not really necessary. It's more for the taste. I think it can be relevant at like an older age. I mean, if you play for at a high level, at high intensities, etc., then it can be useful to drink sports drinks during soccer. But for the young people, it's not necessary, especially not if they have like normal meals and stuff like that, which they, of course, would typically have.
All right, so let's discuss what these sports drinks are supposed to do, and then we'll get into if they indeed do it, if for certain sports they are useful, or if they just taste good, which is so far the unique selling point I've heard. So again, sport drinks, they have water, electrolytes, and carbohydrates. So the fluid, I always find this interesting, is people think that dehydration on its own is like a huge problem, but it's actually not. It's like secondary problems as a result of dehydration. For example, if you're dehydrated in a very cold environment, you barely see any negative consequences from dehydration. It's just that it's very difficult to regulate your body temperature when you're dehydrated. So fluid, you definitely need it in some sports. It's usually pretty obvious. If you sweat a lot, you need to replace it. And I think anyone can envision that sport drinks could be useful for that. Are sports drinks much better at that than normal drinks? We might get into that later, but water alone could do the job in most circumstances. Electrolytes, similar story. You lose them when you're sweating a lot. So if you sweat a lot, you might need to replace them sometimes when you're hungover for some people. But like the main thing that's really a performance, or at least potentially performance maker or breaker, are the carbohydrates. So why do we care about carbohydrates in exercise? Well, you have two main fuels during exercise, carbohydrate and fat. And fat is amazing. We have so much energy as fat in our body. It's kind of crazy. Like, let's say I would run a marathon right now and I would look at my body. I wouldn't be like, wow, I lost almost all my body fat. I have no energy stores anymore. I'm starving. No, I probably wouldn't even notice a difference in the amount of fat mass that I have. So I have more than enough energy in my fat stores to do multiple marathons in a row. No issue. But of course, in practice, it is a little bit of an issue, because even though we can store a lot of energy in our body fat, we can only use that energy at a very low rate. So it would be relatively easy for me to start walking and just keep on walking, because it's very low pace. I only need a little bit of energy. I can get that energy from my fat. I have plenty of fat, unfortunately, so I can just keep on going. But if I'm trying to run a marathon, so much higher pace, that pace would be faster than the energy I could get from my body fat. And that's where carbohydrates come in. Carbohydrates are pretty much the exact opposite. You can only store a relatively small amount of them, but you can use that energy much more rapidly. So anytime you do anything at a relatively high intensity, a relatively large proportion of your energy comes from your carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, they're great. The drawback is just you run out of carbs relatively fast. So after one marathon, there's no way you can do that second marathon at the same pace because you're pretty much out of carbohydrates. So you basically lost one of your fuel sources. Now, when you hear this whole story, you might think, well, why do we store all our energy then as body fat? Why not simply store it as carbohydrates if you can just use it faster? But of course, there's a good reason our bodies do that. As you might know from nutrition, fat is more caloric dense than carbohydrates, and a similar principle applies in your body as well. So 1 gram of body fat has about 7 to 8 calories. It's a little bit different than in your nutrition, but let's not go into that. While 1 gram of carbohydrates has more like 4 calories, which means if you want to store the same amount of energy that you have in your fat in carbohydrate stores in your body, you need double the mass. So you would replace 10 kilograms of fat with 20 kilograms of carbohydrates. So you're much bigger and you're heavier, which is of course not ideal. Now this is complicated even further because to store carbohydrates, which are stored in the form of glycogen, either in the liver or in muscle, you also need to store water, which is like around 3 grams of water for each gram of carbohydrates. So in practice, this means that to store 1 kilogram of body fat, you would replace it with like 6 kilograms of body weight if you want to store muscle glycogen. So that's the reason why we don't have big glycogen stores, because we all would be very huge. We have to carry way more weight around. Carbohydrates are really for relatively short, higher intensity activities. So again, fat, we have plenty. There's no need to take extra fat because we have more than we can burn anyway. Carbohydrates, the exact opposite. So that raises the possibility, hey, if we can only store a little bit of carbohydrates in our bodies, can we take in some carbohydrates during exercise to supplement our limited storage? For example, by taking sports drinks. And that's pretty much what we're gonna discuss here. But the way I just see it as carbohydrates are fuel. If you do something for longer than an hour and you try to do it at a high intensity, you need carbohydrates because it's the only fuel you can use at a high rate. You just need as much carbohydrates available as fuel. So how do you do that? Ideally, you start any sporting event with the highest possible amounts of glycogen stores. During exercise, you want to keep your glucose availability as high as possible. So probably you might have to consume some, for example, sport drinks during exercise. And then after exercise, you want to replenish your glycogen stores as fast as possible, so you're ready for your next training, next competition, etc. So let's get into some details. Milan, let's say that you're gonna train for a marathon, and
thank you.
Yeah, it's very unbelievable, but imagine.
Hypothetical.
So you're training for a marathon. You basically know that carbohydrate stores are important, so you want to have as much carbohydrate available during the race. How do you make sure that at the start of the race you have the biggest possible glycogen stores? How would you approach that, or is absolutely nothing necessary? Maybe you can't even influence it.
Yeah, you can influence it. And I think a lot of people heard of carbohydrate loading before. I think it's already like 50 years ago that the first studies were done on this, and it's was quite interesting because in these first studies think it was somewhere in Scandinavia, and they wanted to see how they could like manipulate muscle glycogen stores before some kind of exercise test, and then they just let the participants do 3 days of like insane training and pretty much no carbohydrate intake. So their glycogen stores were almost fully depleted. And then afterwards, it was 3 days of like very, very high carbohydrate intake. And then basically no training or very, very little. I think it was even no training. And that would then cause like some kind of super compensation. So then because like the muscle is somehow sensitized for carbohydrates and for glycogen synthesis, then the high intake and no activity would really like increase glycogen stores quite a bit. And I think they also showed that it then could increase exercise performance. So I think that's kind of where it originated. So there was already like 1970-ish. And I think pretty soon a lot of people were like, it's not really practical to do such a thing right before an important race or something. So I think much more recently, there have been quite some studies where they just go, you kind of taper your training. So you train a bit less every day and you just increase your carbohydrate intake every day. And that should more or less give the same result. But I think there have been studies, they show that you can, like basically within a couple of days, you can like almost double your muscle glycogen stores, which is pretty insane if you ask me.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it wasn't very practical, but like what part or what exactly isn't practical? Is it the skipping carbs completely for 3 days that suck, or is it you need to eat so much on the other 3 days afterwards that you get sick, or is it the combination of both? Or
Yeah, pretty sure it was both. So I think already a couple days of pretty intense training with not a lot of carbs will be tough, also mentally and also physically. And then also the 3 days where you have no training but need to eat a shitload of carbs. Because I think often a lot of protocols, they say like a lot of carbs is like 10 grams per kilogram body weight per day. So if you're like 80 kilograms, that's 800 grams of carbs. So that's already like, what is like more than 3,000 calories per day. And that's only the carbs. That's not even protein or fat. Like, yeah, and if you're then not even exercising, you'll probably have trouble. Also maybe trouble on the toilet. But yeah, I think quite fast after those studies, because I think those first studies were also not really done in like very trained athletes. So I think quite fast they were kind of looking for alternatives to see how you could like manipulate glycogen stores just before a race.
but so the idea is solid and it works. Like you kind of starve your muscle from carbohydrates, so your body starts upregulating enzymes to try to replete the carbohydrates, so they're ready. Like as soon as we get carbs, we're gonna store as much as possible, and then all of a sudden you introduce a lot of carbohydrates. So it definitely works. It's just like you say, it's not ideal, and especially I think the mental part that you mentioned is quite important. Because like you say, you train 3 days very intense while you're going pretty much as low carb as possible. So those trainings will be horrible. Like you'll just not be as good as you're normally. And then the next 3 days you don't train at all. So it just means the entire week before your marathon, you have basically not done a good training session, or at least you had no performance like you're used to, and that can just mess with you. Like it's easy to read like it's okay if your training isn't as solid as you're used to, because we're carbohydrate depleting. But at the end of the day, we're all human. If you just have a crappy training week before your big race, it just gets in your head. And then the other point that you mentioned of sitting on the toilet, if you have to eat so many carbs, you also tend to get quite a bit of fiber. So yeah, that can cause a lot of GI distress if you're not used to it.
I mean, I guess there, sports drink could be helpful, just because otherwise it will be pretty difficult to get all the carbs in. So it is a way to increase your carbohydrate intake. But
Okay, so why is it easier to get your carbs in with a sports drink then?
well, like you say, it's a fluid, so it doesn't really doesn't fill you up as solid foods. Yeah, and you also, for example, with other food products, you usually also have some fats and some protein, and that's also not really the case with the sports drink. So I don't think you really need it for carb loading, but it could probably help if you really want to get high into to your carbohydrate intake.
Yeah, and the carbohydrates themselves are sugars, so it just requires less digestion. But then would you recommend people sports drinks, or if they are like, can I just take like cola or some soda like drink, would that not result in more or less the same effect?
Yeah, for sure. Like just like lemonade, or I don't know, like cola. I think anything
Aquarius.
with sugar, Aquarius, if you
For the
if you're
taste and the
Cas.
cool bottle.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, and anything with sugar would do the trick, I would say.
So yeah, carbohydrate loading quite important. You don't have to do weird high-low training, high-low carb strategies. You just need to taper towards the event where you do less and less training over the week, so you're not using up all your carbs, and you slowly increase your carb intake every day up to the race. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, I've also seen some other protocols. I think it has been studied a bit less, but it's like very short. It's even like within a day, and I think also with very high carb intake and like very low training load, you can also even in a day like increase glycogen quite a bit. So that's also quite interesting. I'm not sure whether it has been compared directly with like a longer taping versus like a day, but I think there's some more evidence that maybe you can even get the same result, or at least a good result, with even shorter than a full week. I'm not really sure about the specifics.
Yeah, you're
Because
right, Milan.
yeah, I wanted to ask, are you familiar with that protocol?
Yeah, I think if you go, let's say 2-3 days before the event, if you would have a very high carb intake and you would then also taper your training, so go a bit down in the kind of training load that you do, then you can basically get the same results. So if you look at the different, so indeed the protocols that Milan just discussed. So first, let's say the classical protocol, the first one, so the more tough one. That works fine, but then the more moderate one, the second one, works as well, and this is what they call now the updated one. There's like a nice review article from 2009, 17 or 19, and they also showed indeed if you just do taper, like let's say 2 days before you have a very high carb intake, and your training, your training is basically much reduced, your training intensity, your training duration, etc., then you can get the same results. You can double the amount of muscle glycogen storage in your muscle.
Yeah. That's still such it sounds so crazy to me that it's fairly difficult, I would say, in the long term to like build up your glycogen stores, to just like keep increasing them, but then like in such a short amount of time you can somehow almost double it. That is just so crazy. Yeah, because it's just
something that I was thinking about is that maybe it's good if we can kind of talk about what sport events we actually mean, because we're mentioning, this is something you can do before an event, but would you do it before a soccer game, or would
Before a
you
gym
do-
session.
before a gym session, right?
Milan does it. Milan does it every week.
Do it every day.
I've
Continuously
seen
in a
Milan
high
eat.
carb diet with a
Yeah.
capsule on. Has some protein involved as well.
Exactly.
French fries.
It's forever carb loading.
That's why he's doing it. It's continuously carb loading. It's all cycle of it.
No,
Exactly.
I thought we were preparing Milan for a marathon.
Yeah. Hypothetically.
Hypothetically, but we all know that's not going to happen.
So Milan, what would it take for us to challenge you to do a marathon?
Like
I think a year-long everyday capsule on our payment.
The triple is glycogen.
I just really no, I don't feel
I'll
the
put you on a
need to do
paper.
anything like that. No, it's just I don't know, it's not worth it for me. No.
I'll put
Then
you on a
I just
paper.
also don't like running. Like I do like cycling. So if you challenge me that I can cycle like I don't know 100K or something, like I would maybe take the challenge, but nah, not running.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right, but so far, carbohydrate loading seems quite important. But sports drinks, yeah, if it helps you get your carbs in, it's great. But it's just a tool. It doesn't really have any unique benefits, right?
Mm.
All right, then on to the next stage. So now Milan is doing his marathon. Does he have a benefit from sports drinks during a marathon? Floof, do you have some insights?
Sure. So, yeah, let's imagine that Milan has decided to run a marathon one day. I think he could benefit for sure from let's say ingesting carbohydrates during the run. So if you use like a sports drink, for example. So basically what happens is when you ingest carbohydrates during exercise, your body will then start to use that, and you can use that for fuel as well during the exercise. So not just what's already in your stores, but what you get from your, let's say, your drink. What we also know about that is that in your gut, you have basically like these transporters that will transport the glucose and the sugars, right? So that's basically how it goes into your system and stuff. But we know that there is a certain limit to that. So if you keep ingesting more and more drink or more and more carbohydrates, then you'll basically just start feeling sick at some point because it'll just start to accumulate faster than you can actually use it. So that's something you also need to be careful of if you were to run a marathon.
Okay, so is that the reason why you need your glycogen stores to be high at the start? Because theoretically, if you could absorb all your carbs, then you also don't need to be high as long as you take in enough. But you're saying you cannot, your gut cannot take up carbohydrates as fast as you would like. Therefore, there's a limit to what you can burn from your drinks because you simply cannot take it up. And therefore, the loading is important.
So wait, what's your question? Whether loading is important? Or...
Well, so I'm thinking like we discussed, you need to get this glycogen as high as possible at the start. But theoretically, that's not possible. It's not necessary if you could just burn enough carbohydrates from your sports drinks during the event, right? But because I think you're saying you cannot absorb as much carbs as you want. There's just a limit to that. And that's not enough to support like your maximal intensity. And thus you still want to load you basically want to do both. You want to load and you want to get as much from your drink as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the big question is how do you know how much you can get from your drink?
Yeah, so I mean, there have been studies done showing kind of the rate at which you can kind of use these sugars, and it seems that there's a specific transporter for glucose and those sugars, but so the rate of that is about 1 gram per minute or something, but you actually that's basically the cap. You can't really go higher than that, but there's kind of a hack for that. We know that fructose is actually used by a different transporter, or transported with a different kind of transporter. So if you ingest fructose on top of your glucose, then you can actually increase that cap because you're using two different transporters to get the sugar in. So I think that's what, like 1.2 grams per minute if you have both at the same time.
Yeah, you can get a little bit higher, up to 1.5, something like that.
Oh,
But
1.5, yeah.
but that's pretty much, even at that rate, most people tend to start feeling it. Let's put it like that. So yeah, I think in practice most people will stay a little bit below 1.5, even though theoretically they might absorb still most of it. Okay, so people have some guidelines then of how much carbohydrates should be in their sport drink. So glucose and fructose, like a maximum you're saying of 1 gram of glucose per minute, and then like half of that in fructose.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you know, is that like theoretical, or has it been shown to improve performance? Like, do you think the performance effect is like big, small?
I believe that it has been shown, but yeah, the details on the studies I don't remember.
So do you think people need to drink sport drinks for this, or can they get it from food, or maybe sometimes you hear like gels or other products?
I mean, it doesn't have to be a drink per se. I mean, drinks are good because they're probably easier to physically ingest if let's say you're running a marathon. I mean, that's why gels also come in handy, because they also tend to be they weigh less than, like, let's say like an actual bottle. It kind of depends on the sport what you want to do. I know cyclists as well, they can ingest a bar easily on the go, but if you're running, that's kind of more difficult as well. But yeah, I mean, there's also other benefits of a drink versus solid food, that you'll probably digest it more quickly because it's already a fluid. So that's kind of the benefit of that. But as long as you're able to get the carbohydrates in, I think that's good. And as long as your stomach can handle it as well. It's always the issue.
So unfortunately, none of us has ever done a marathon, but Kaz and I have been to a marathon. Hey Kaz, what do I need to do to challenge you for a marathon?
Depends on if it's a full, a half, or like a quarter one.
Well, what do you think?
If it's 1/4 of a marathon, then I am down for it.
Like I've never done a marathon, but I'm pretty sure I will do one eventually, just to get it off my list, and also
like a full one, you mean?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, the one
that will be hilarious. I will come and watch.
I doubt
you'll. I will give you the drinks as well.
I'll doubt that you'll come and watch, because the one I want to do is in China on the, how is it called? The big wall of China. So it's basically a marathon on that wall. So that's pretty crazy.
But Jorn, how much, like, what's the furthest you've ever ran?
I have no clue.
Like 2K?
But no, more than 2K. But well, before you were ever around, Alejandra, we did the Mud Masters with the M3 group.
Oh,
I was in tip-top shape back then. No. So okay, so
you were running like half a year ago or something, I think, wasn't it?
No, I do run. I always, when the topic comes up, I act like I hate it, but actually I'm pretty sure I outrun all of you. But
still
anyway,
have a voice in your head, right?
Exactly.
So say it again, Jorn.
Well, so with most sports, it's easy to focus on like a quick event, like do a quick sprint, do a set of bench press. But with running, it's like it just keeps going. So when I run, I always have a voice in my head that just says, if you stop now, all the pain is over, just stop. Well, if you bench press, it's like, you need to press this thing up, otherwise you die. It's very easy to get motivated for that, and then 5 seconds later, life is awesome. But with running, is just every step you take, you get farther away from home. Just turn around. So yeah, I have good debates in my head during running.
It's actually a good example, Jorn, because I'm running this study in cyclists, right? Where I'm like asking them to really deplete their glycogen, so they have to really cycle till they really basically cannot go anymore. And I'm also sometimes, if there's like, if you talk to people, maybe interested in your study, one of the first questions is, are you like a really well-trained cyclist? Because if you're not, you have like people like what you just say, they feel like, yeah, I can cycle or whatever. They'll be in the bike, and like after half an hour, their voice is like overruling their actual performance, and it's like, now I'm completely done. And you measure them in the scan, and they still have like a very high amount of glycogen. That's not what I want. So that's actually interesting that these really good cyclists, they can really somehow go over that stage that they feel like they also feel the pain, but they can just keep going and ignore it basically.
How fast do you get, like, can you already quantify your glycogen like on the test day, or do you really have to sit down later and do your analysis?
So yeah, with the scan you mean then?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the peaks. So what you get is like a spectrum. So you can see like a peak of the glycogen on my screen when I have them in the MRI scan. But then what I can see, for example, if I measure them before and after cycling, I can see that the peak becomes smaller.
Yeah.
And the peak doesn't tell me anything else yet than that it's lower, because the concentrations, we still have to do that in post-processing or post-analysis. But you can get an idea of that the protocol has worked, but the exact concentrations I don't know on the spot.
But it's like, that's like, I've done glycogen work, but with muscle biopsies, and you get that data like months later when you analyze everything. So I don't have halfway during my test day that I'm like, oh God, this guy barely did what he had to do. Why am I here? But anyway, back to our marathon. So Cas and I went to a sports science congress that was in Berlin, and there was also the marathon of Berlin at that time. So we were handing out carbohydrate gels. Do you remember, Cas?
Yeah, do you know what year it is?
No, I have no clue.
It was, I think it was 2015. It's a while ago.
Yeah, we're getting old.
But I remember that well. Yeah, that was funny. I remember the best thing was what I remember. We were standing at that. Was it the Nestle? No, the
Power bar.
Power bar, exactly. So standing at that power bar like stand, and at some point we were like standing there because we could give the gels to like these people. So we were standing there, Jorn and me. And
Well,
like,
so
first of all,
just
we had, like,
very
the
quickly,
leads.
sorry to interrupt, but just for context. So you're standing in such a way that someone can just run by and grab it without slowing down. It's not like there's a desk where you, like, the people don't,
Yeah.
like, people who are crazy enough about their sport gels, they want optimal performance. So, like, you have to stand like this, and they have to be very easily snatched out of your hand. You can't hold it too hard, and it's actually quite difficult because like every slight thing is just annoying to the athletes. But go on, Cas.
Yeah, so the first elite guys came by and they didn't even bat an eye. They were just like straightly focused, didn't even watch at us. And then you had like the whole group of the like the sub-elite people, like they came and they were like grabbing as much as they could, and they were like falling over each other and like shouting at each other as well, like, oh, fuck you. And I was holy shit, what's going on here? But and then I remember one guy, he took a gel from someone, I don't even think it was me, maybe yours, Jorn, and then he looked at it like, oh fuck, there's caffeine in it, and he threw it away, and then he was like annoyed because he already passed the stand and he didn't have his gel. He probably was caffeine sensitive or something. But that was I remember these things quite well because it was quite a funny situation.
But it's yeah, what you said, like that a lot of the elite guys pass the stand because these guys tend to really plan out their nutrition, so they know exactly at this many kilometers there's a person I know will be handing me exactly the product that I want in the exact quantity, so they won't go to like a free stand where we were helping. But okay, so if I summarize sport drinks during an event like a marathon, they can definitely help. You don't want too much because they can even make you sick. and you want somewhere between 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates in a combination of glucose and fructose. Does that sum it up, Alejandra?
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, sport drinks useful, but no secret weapon. Like a bar is just as good theoretically.
Yeah, I would say so. But like I said, again, it's circumstantial. Depends on, I would say for a marathon, I personally wouldn't go for a bar.
Yeah. It's like if you do a Tour de France event, which is longer, you want to have some solid foods as well, where typically you see that the first half are mostly things like bars, and then in the second half they switch more to drinks and gels. Okay, so somehow Milan has survived his marathon, but then then you have me again, who challenged him to do it again in 2 days. How is he ever gonna do that, Gus? So can he like recover quickly? Those glycogen stores, does he have to load for a whole week again? Should he take his AA, his after exercise? That's how it's marketed. So hopefully the drinks are super useful there. What's your advice?
Yeah, if he has to do another marathon and 2 days later, then I would say take his AA. And a bit more than that, because yeah, simply said, I mean, in 2 days marathon running, it's a bit tricky because you get quite some impact on the muscles. So you may have some muscle damage also depending on your training status. In Milan's case of marathon running, he probably has like very sore muscles and a lot of muscle damage. And in that case, we know from studies that it will take a bit longer before his glycogen stores can be fully recovered if you have a very high carbohydrate diet. So let's say about 3 days it would take him to be like at the normal level. But then the question would of course be, I mean, I know we're sticking to carbohydrates, but if he is indeed like good enough again to run, and if he is not still sore from the previous marathon. But that's on the side, because let's assume that Milan is very well trained and his muscle soreness is not that big, and he doesn't have a lot of muscle damage. In that case, he could potentially restore his glycogen stores in both the muscle as well as in the liver within these 2 days, if he again has a very high carb diet.
So let's say was cycling, Gus.
Yeah.
That's like a low impact sport, less muscle damage. How fast would he be able to replete his glycogen stores?
Muscle within 24 hours, and liver I believe it's even faster. With liver, I think it's about within 12 hours they can be replenished. And maybe liver on the side, on a quick note, is also important to supply carbohydrates in your body during exercise. So it's also a good way to store carbohydrates just in general, because you need it. For example, if you go to sleep, you need to fuel the brain with glucose, and the liver is supplying that glucose. But also during exercise, you can use that reservoir that's stored in the liver to give you energy during the exercise for your working muscle. So with cycling, you can do that within a day. With running it may be a little bit longer, and with things like more impact, if you would go downhill running, for example, and a lot of eccentric or like stretching contractions, then it will take longer. So then again, you'll go more towards the 3 days.
Okay, so a sport with muscle damage will take multiple days because glycogen depletion is delayed. Then a sport without much muscle damage can be done within a day. But you also have like sports that have like a tournament structure. For example, something like ice hockey, where you have like 5 matches over a 2-day period. So how much can you accomplish like in, I don't know, in 4 hours was maybe what you have between 2 matches. What would
4
you...
hours, just in 4 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, you can replete your glycogen stores, but I mean, depending, of course, on the intensity and the duration of your previous exercise session, they will not be back to baseline. But if you really need to replenish them fast, you can do it by just ingesting a lot of carbohydrates. And maybe if it's such a short duration, what could be relevant is by combining again glucose and fructose, for example, in the simple form of a sugar cube, which is sucrose, because sucrose contains glucose and fructose in a 50 or like a 1-to-1 ratio, so 50% of each. And that could be relevant because we have shown actually that if you take in that mixture of glucose and fructose, that you will double your repletion rate of the liver. So, and that is compared to glucose on itself. So if you would take the advantage again of combining glucose with fructose, you can actually replete your liver faster and your muscle goes equally fast. So, but overall in your body, you will store more carbohydrates than if you would just take like glucose kind of products.
And then for these three scenarios, so let's call it super fast repletion, let's say 4 hours. Let's call it relatively fast repletion, so within a day, and in like 2-3 days after more muscle damaging sports. Would you recommend sport drinks? Can Milan finally have his AA drink, or would you recommend like whole wheat pasta or anything else? Like what type of carbs, or does it barely matter?
Yeah, it's really depending on the context. But to give you an example, if it's in the short term, so let's say the 4 hours, I would say try to get quite some carbs in, and that can be helpful with sports drinks. But you also have to take into account you get a lot of fluid in your body, then that may be a disadvantage for your next exercise session, depending on what kind of exercise it is. So maybe you want to mix and get like an ideal combination of fluids with some solid foods, at least some that are very easily digestible, so some easy sugars, I would say. If it's for longer duration, such as 24 hours or 2 to 3 days, then it doesn't really matter that much anymore. I mean, if I would go back to the example of cycling, and you need to fully replenish a day after, and I mean, given that you did cycling exercise, we know from studies that you can replete or can fully replenish your stores within a day. Then also studies have shown that it doesn't really matter if you would go for like some solid foods or if you would go for the sports drinks. I would probably say just take a mixture if I would be the coach for athletes. Just get some drinks and fast after, and then you can just get for your normal high carb meals.
This reminds me, you talking about glycogen reminds me of, again, that Congress in Berlin. Do you remember Brett Ruby, I think he's called?
Yeah.
Do you know where I'm getting at now?
You mean what happened there, or just
no, no? That's what happened there stays there. No, he did a study where he compared like sports nutrition products, so sport drinks, sport gels, to a fast food meal, and then if you provide those two things in with the same macronutrient content, they basically do the same job at...
Jorn, maybe don't say this because Milan will get happy about it.
He's like, okay, now I'll sign up for
the incentive now to use it then.
So after my marathon, I can get a capsule.
Exactly, that's what it comes down to, basically.
That's all I needed to know.
Or to the McDonald's. You can also replenish your glycogen stores then.
Okay, so I have to ask you this, Gus, otherwise Luke gets mad because he did a study on this, but what's the role of protein in all of this?
For like glycogen specifically, or for recovery?
Yeah, for glycogen specifically.
So protein is on itself not a good substrate for glycogen recovery. And of course, protein is built up out of amino acids. That's, I think, important to know, because if people eat protein, it will be digested in the body into the amino acids, and that can be used by the body. But those, I mean, even though there are quite some amino acids that are what we call glucogenic, which basically means that we can convert them into glucose, it's not being used by the body really as a good substrate source to use as to restore your glycogen in the body. But if you are one of these athletes that has difficulties with getting a lot of carbohydrates in the system, so not talking about guys like Milan here, but just like people that are actually having difficulties with getting a lot of carbohydrates in, they could benefit from taking some extra protein, because protein has also some amino acids that are insulinotropic, which means that they give like an increase in insulin in your body. And that insulin can basically very easily open up your muscle cells, and thereby you get more carbs into your muscles, and you can actually really increase the glycogen stores in your muscles by mixing a lot of carbs with some protein. Aside from, of course, the other benefit of protein, which is simply for the repair mechanism and the adaptive response. So you can also use these amino acids to repair the damaged proteins during exercise, but also to rebuild and make actually new functional proteins that can help you in the long term. By with running, getting more mitochondrial proteins, for example, or to build your muscle if you would go for more into strength training, if you look at it from a very black and white perspective.
All right, so glucose plus fructose for sure. And well, in practice, you probably always will consume some protein, which might have some benefit if you didn't reach the optimal amount of carbohydrates. Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
What about, so we discussed a little bit about, well, let's first wrap this thing up. So let me know if this accurately represents basically what you guys have told me. Sport drinks can help in all these circumstances, but in none of these circumstances they are needed. It's just an easy way to get in the required amount of carbohydrates, sometimes in a cool looking bottle that tastes well.
I would agree, but maybe I could think of some situations that if I would position myself as a coach, and especially during exercise, I would still advise them. And it's not only because of a quick way to get carbs in, but also because of the dehydration that occurs during exercise. Especially if you go into like hot environments, for example, and you sweat a lot, then I would say like they are at some point, they probably will be needed, or you have to drink water with like a bar or whatever. But then I think it's really much more convenient to go for like the mix of sugary drink. And the same may count for if you, and there's not that much research done on that area, but if you look at, for example, if I go back to before exercise, I don't think it matters that much because you can plan it really well in the days before, but also after a match, and you really, let's say you do the Tour de France and you have to perform again the day after, then also you can still be quite a lot of hypohydration, so you're dehydrated after the exercise session, and it can also be useful and actually necessary to get your fluid balance back to normal. Because that could also hamper your recovery if it's not really if you're not really well hydrated.
And that's then both of those situations where you see some use that is, I think, in pretty high level athletes, I guess. So if Milan would run a marathon, it probably wouldn't matter that much if he got it from a drink or a bar. No offense, Milan. But if someone tries to run a sub 2 hour marathon, they want everything optimized, and probably sport drinks are part of that. And then same if you have like a multi-day event, in practice you're gonna need sport drinks.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
And then let's go to the opposite. Let's say we have someone watching with, let's say, a 15-year-old kid that's quite ambitious in sport, might have a good career in front of them. We don't know yet. They're too young to really determine that. But they try to do everything well, so they always have like their sports drink during every soccer practice. Do we think that is absolutely not necessary? Do we think that is detrimental? Do we think it's potentially good? Where do we stand on that?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's probably not really necessary, even though in theory, if you would take some sports drink or carbohydrates during practice or during trainings, you could train slightly better maybe. But I think in the end, it probably won't matter in the long term. So, I mean, I wouldn't, and for sure for a child, I wouldn't advise it. But I think in general, I think most people don't really need it during practice. It's more about when performance really matters, and that's a race. So yeah, I wouldn't advise it at all.
Yeah, and you now also have a line of thought that you should avoid, or at least sometimes avoid, carbohydrates during training, the so-called train low. Have you guys heard of that, and do you have an opinion on it?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I've actually never tried it myself, but yeah, I think that the idea is that you deplete muscle glycogen. So, for example, with like a heavy or intense training, and then you you stay low in carbohydrates, so you don't replete the glycogen stores, and then like you train again. I think that's kind of the idea, that you train with low glycogen, and that should kind of like improve, especially fat oxidation, or at least the use of fat for fuel during exercise, and that would then eventually, yeah, be beneficial during a race, because if you can also use fat more efficiently next to carbs, then yeah, that would improve your performance. But I mean, yeah, I've never done it or anything like that.
So the idea is that sometimes you train with carbohydrates because you know you don't want your body to forget how to use carbohydrates, and sometimes you train without, and then the goal is to have like the optimal capacity to burn fat because you're kind of trained in that, and the optimal capacity to burn carbohydrates, so kind of best of both worlds. At least that's the aim. There's something to be said of that. I don't think there's very convincing evidence that it's better than like a normal carbohydrate diet. There's some suggestions that it might, but in my opinion, nothing convincing. What if we take it one more step to the extreme? Let's say a ketogenic diet, which is basically the same principle as train low, but then rather saying we sometimes train low so that we force our body to burn fat. Now we try to avoid carbohydrates as much as possible, and we really force our body to burn as much fat as possible.
Jorn, it's a good point what you raised now, but can I quickly go back to the previous point about the let's say the periodized nutrition approach, where you are like in the fast, because I fully agree with what you said, that there's not really a lot of convincing evidence. And also what Milan said, there are quite some studies that have shown that if you would not ingest carbohydrates, you do see like the gene expression and like things in your muscle being upregulated that should lead to eventually to beneficial effects on things like fat oxidation, mitochondrial biogenesis. So you make like more mitochondria that can be helpful to give you energy during exercise. But then there are few studies, especially if you look at, I mean, there are different strategies that you can apply with that periodized nutrition, and one of them is a sleep low approach, where, for example, people are exercising really intensely before they go, basically in the evening, so before they go to sleep. Then overnight, they don't eat any carbohydrates before, also, of course, not during the night because they're sleeping. And then the day after, they would train again, basically, so with a low amounts of glycogen in the body. And then that approach there are at least a few studies that have shown that could indeed lead to some performance benefits. I would agree there's much more data that we need to really be like convinced, I think, about that specific strategy, but there is some evidence to suggest that it may be beneficial.
Yeah, I agree that the sleep low I would classify them as interesting, but I think the same group of researchers, so Louis Burke, has done, let's call it similar studies, but then even better. And there you don't really see the benefit of periodized nutrition, even though it wasn't the exact sleep low approach. But I think you know the study that I mean, where they compare like ketogenic versus
diet.
high carb versus periodized. And there very clearly the periodized diet made the athletes worse. Probably I'm making some people upset now.
No, but you mean that with the elite race walkers, that study?
Yeah.
Because that was the periodized was as good as the high carb, and
exactly.
the ketogenic diet indeed was was worse.
Yeah, but they're like, until I've seen like a benefit from the periodize / sleep low in a situation like that, the other ones are, I classify them as interesting, but they haven't convinced me yet. Don't get me wrong, that's now me as scientist talking. As a coach, I would definitely play around with a sleep low approach because it's a really low opportunity cost. There's not a whole lot to assume that occasionally training with a sleep low approach would make you worse. So I would definitely play around with it in practice. I'm just not convinced that it will result in positive adaptations.
No, I agree on that point, but what I would say is that what I do find interesting, because there are now also studies that show no benefit of periodize necessarily over continuously high carb. So you could basically say you can use both for performance. But for example, if I go a little bit, take a sidestep here, I think the dentist would be way more happy if you would kind of sometimes have high carb and sometimes not. So if you look at overall health and like your mouth health, for example, your dental health, then it's I think as a coach interesting to really play around. And if you don't need to have your athletes continuously on high carbs, then maybe it can be useful to use the carbs in a periodized approach where you basically take them on the time that you need them and you don't take them on the time that you don't need them. And I mean, people may also say like, yeah, and also maybe for like insulin and that people get diabetic. For an elite athlete, that's nothing to worry about. But yeah, I mean, of course, I'm talking again about elite athletes here, not people that are on the couch or like sitting the whole day behind like a microscope such as Milan. But like,
I think the keto diet
that's good to take into account. I mean, sometimes things may not be necessarily better, but they may give you the same benefit and maybe have some other like slight advantages that may be relevant for overall health, for example.
I like that Mr. Aesthetics is worried about dental health. But it is relevant to the topic because sports drinks, of course, have like sugars, which are not the best for your teeth. But there was also recently a study who looked at like carbohydrate oxidation, so how much carbohydrates can you burn as fuel during exercise, and there they wanted to see if like these commercial drinks, because they also tend to be like a little bit acidic. So that study was actually designed to look at the dental health effect of sport drinks. So it's not just the carbs, it's even slightly worse than that. Again, like, yeah, some people are like, yeah, it's the last thing I would ever care about, but all things being equal, it is maybe something to take into account. Okay, so what about we discussed a really talented kid. What about just...
I think you still wanted to go into the ketogenic diet or not?
Yeah, well, I think I kind of indicated what I thought about it, is that it's pretty consistently worse. I don't know if you have something to add or maybe disagree.
For the elite athletes, I would agree. I would never advise an athlete to go into a ketogenic diet.
Okay, and then for an average person?
For recreational people, I mean, if you don't do it, I mean, if you would say, I feel better with it and I'm not really concerned about performance, yeah, fine. If you
but then my question is, why would an average person do it if they're not that worried about performance? Because it's like, it is relatively difficult. Like, everyone reads about ketogenic diet and thinks like, I can have bacon and eggs every morning and that's better, that sounds awesome, but they'll realize...
I think a lot of people that I know personally who try to do a ketogenic diet, it's not for performance, it's because they think that's how they get lean.
Yeah.
But like, I'm quite opinionated on that.
Do you know how many of those people like stuck to it for like 6 months or longer?
No, none of them. I know that my brother, he like for a while got into the ketogenic diet, which is quite interesting. And he also, like you said, Cas, like the people who say, oh, I feel better on it. So that I'm not going to tell them, okay, don't do it if you feel better. But then there's a part of me that's like, do you feel better or do you think you feel better? So yeah,
it's maybe more with like the types of nutrition that they can eat. Some people indeed, what Jorn said, like, I love to eat bacon every morning. I'm not saying it's more healthy, don't get me wrong. And I also think people can get leaner on a ketogenic diet, but it's not because of the ketogenic diet. It's simply because of the lower energy intake that they get by not getting a lot of carbs in. Because if you look at carbohydrate products such as rice and pasta, for example, for the amount of weight, they contain a lot of carbs, which is then on average, on total, actually, it's quite a lot of calories. So by not taking those, you can get leaner. But I mean, you can also get leaner by just weigh your carbs, or just don't eat and need too much carbs, or just use them at the right times before you go training, for example.
Yeah, that's true. And I've also heard with the ketogenic diet that like you're just less hungry, just because carbs also with like fluxes in insulin and stuff like that, that you also your hunger hormones also fluctuate as well. So there's that argument too. But
I'm skeptical.
Okay. I could also say if you have fiber-rich carbs, you also can get like.
I'm skeptical that the ketogenic diet helps with, let's call it through hormonal regulation of hunger. I think if it helps, it's because if you cut out your carbs, you tend to increase your percentage of protein, and that one is more hunger suppressing. I doubt, so that like that would mean that the average person, it might help, but it's more because they increase their protein, not because they decrease their carbs. But I don't have this at the top of my head from the literature, but I doubt under protein matched conditions that a ketogenic diet suppresses hunger. I don't know if anyone of you knows the literature that well.
No, I don't. This is just speaking from anecdotal stuff.
No, so it really, like if you're going to eat bacon, I think you're going to overeat on a ketogenic diet. If you eat a lot of eggs, you're probably going to reduce your caloric intake. So it's like the one ketogenic diet is not the other ketogenic diet, right? So it's difficult to judge them all. Okay, maybe one last question that I can think of, and then I see some questions from the chat. We discussed, like, would you give your 15-year-old kid that's highly ambitious, wants to make it to the NFL, would you give him a sports drink? Maybe sometimes, Milan said. Depends a little bit on the context. Now, what about you have, like, I don't know which age this happens, but you have like kids in high school and they have like physical education. So they have to do like 1 hour of exercise 3 times a week at high school. Should sport drinks be provided?
Quite funny because when I was younger, when I was like,
that's a long time ago.
Basically. No, when I was about 13 years old, in PE, we had to run the mile every so often as part of our like we get a grade if we get under a certain amount of minutes. And I would always bring a bottle of Sprite just before the mile, and I would drink that. And I'm pretty sure it ended up actually hampering my performance every time because I end up getting a stomach ache. But I was just convinced that like that's what I needed to the sugars to get me through. But yeah.
But that's like in sports nutrition, one of the first things we always say is don't do something when you have to perform that you're totally not used to. So if you all of a sudden start drinking a sports drink, which you might not be used to before exercise, just having just the fluid alone in your stomach, if you're not used to it, that might mess things up. If you have a lot more carbs than you're used to, that might mess you up. But what do you think, Floof? Should it be encouraged for just average persons to, during every training, have some sport drinks, or only if high performance is important?
So your scenario was the average kid who just needs to like sport 3 times a week or something. Yeah, definitely not before. I don't really see a use in that. I assume these kids are just, having normal diets and they're not starving. So like they will have enough carbohydrates to get them through whatever session. Probably not during either. I don't think that's going to help them because, like I said, they don't need to perform at such levels where they're depleting their glycogen, and after could be useful, but more from the standpoint of like, recovery and hydration and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I wouldn't say that it's maybe because it tastes good. I don't know, but not for Yeah, I don't see any reason why I would recommend it to someone who's not trying to like perform really well in a specific sport.
And what about sport drinks in the supermarket? Like, should they be there? Because, like, I think we discussed this in the beginning. Like, maybe they're even sold more as soda than as for what we think that they're useful for, namely when performance really matters, probably when you exercise like 90 minutes or more. Maybe they should only be available in web shops almost, because now like teenagers are like, oh, I'll drink it just for fun, basically. Like, what I'm trying to get at, like, should sport drinks stay for like serious athletes, or
Well, if they taste good and Gus is going to drink his Aquarius, then why shouldn't we let him?
well,
Used, they don't do it anymore.
I could come up with some reasons why people shouldn't, because it's like sports drinks are really good at what they're supposed to do. The problem is what they're supposed to do is be the most effective way to get in your high amounts of carbohydrates. That is only useful for like a niche, like high performing, serious competitors, basically. And I think there's quite some sales to average Joes who probably shouldn't have a drink that efficiently gets a lot of carbohydrates or any calorie in them. So I think like
I know what you're getting at there. Like, I mean, if I look at it just from a holistic perspective, then you can consider like, yeah, there's plenty of reasons why there's no problem. But if you consider that a lot of people are going to be drinking it who probably shouldn't, then that's like a lot of extra sugar, a lot of extra calories. So it ends up being an unhealthy choice. If it's marketed as a sports drink, you might think, oh, it's healthy. And then people will go for that and end up doing the opposite for their health.
yeah.
I think that's the main thing. I think people should be more aware about if it's useful or not. I think it's a very interesting discussion that you can have, but it's also a difficult one, because if you would choose to get them out of the supermarkets, then people may also think, I'm gonna buy them online and bring them in my bag anyways to school, and then it's actually a cool thing to have like with cigarettes, for example. It's then a cool thing for like these young people, and that's also not what you want to achieve. So I don't know. I mean, and it's not something that, it's not like a drug or something. I mean, carbohydrates is perfectly metabolized in your body. It's just like that the amount of drinks that they think is often not necessary, and it can accumulate to it an increase in energy intake every day, and that's why people can get more fat. But I think the main thing is that people know, like, okay, you don't need sports drinks most of the time. And if that's what people then can use, and they can still be available in the supermarket, but people should just be aware of that. Okay, you can buy them, and I think there's quite a lot of alternatives these days with, like, for example, Coca-Cola Zero or Cola Light, or these brands that don't contain sugar. And then I know there's also a lot of people say, yeah, but all like the sweeteners, it's also unhealthy. No, it's not. But yeah, I mean, there are like alternatives that people can use and still have the taste of a cola, for example.
One more quick question, and then I will cover questions from chat. I just remember, because we discussed the AA in the beginning, I can't get over it. Like recently, AA has like a new product that also has branched chain amino acids added to the product. You've done some research on branched chain amino acids, Cas. So do you think sport drinks should start adding BCAAs to their formulations?
I don't see a use of that now.
Can you very briefly cover why?
Because branched chain amino acids have been thought of as maybe a fuel source during exercise. Well, we know it's not better than sugar. Actually, it's worse than sugar. So you may simply be better off by just get like simple sugars in. And also for recovery, I don't see a benefit, because I mean, we do see in research that with branched chain amino acids, you can stimulate the like, let's say, the acute muscle growth response. You can, but it's not better than if you take protein. And actually, if you take protein, it's a better way to stimulate it. So also in that regard, I don't see necessarily a benefit of branched chain amino acids there. I think it's better to just, if you really have an intense exercise session for a prolonged duration, to get your simple sugars in, support that exercise to at least exercise at a high performance. And after exercise, if you want to focus on recovery, you just need to get your protein meal in, whichever that is. Is it chicken or quark or milk or capsulon for Milan, or these kind of things?
Okay, let's cover some questions from the chat.
I actually think, Jorn, before you go to good old chat again, I think if people are really following these kind of chats of us, that they will at some point will probably look up what is a capsulon, what does Milan guys always do. People will figure it out soon enough, especially from abroad that are not from the Netherlands and they don't know what it is.
They look it up and
Maybe
they just see
Milan
it's a
makes it
barber.
famous.
Like
I'll put on a photo.
My assumption is that like 4% of all our followers know what research Milan does, but like 80% knows that he loves capsulons. Okay, so on the Discord, Adam
Maybe
asks...
one more thing, and that's actually, I think, good insight.
I'm so sorry, chat.
actually-
I don't know if we're going to get to your questions ever.
Yeah, chat has to wait.
So-
Milan actually, on his door in his office, he has a picture of a capsule where he is bathing in it.
Yeah.
That means enough. That
So-
people know this guy loves a capsule.
Maybe quickly for the people who are listening to this and not watching it. So it's an aluminum tray and it has fries. Then it has kebab meat. Then it has a shitload of garlic sauce. Then it has a shitload of cheese. Then you melt the cheese. And then you put like 2 leaves of lettuce on it for
That's healthy.
the healthy snack. And then it's finished. That's a capsule.
When I
Lekker.
when I went to the first time to Canada, they asked like, "Have you ever had a poutine?" And I'm like, "No." So they gave me a poutine, and I just started eating it. And they're like, "You don't seem very impressed." And I was like, in my mind, I was like, "Yeah, this is like 1/4 of a capsulon. Like you just left out 3/4 of the ingredients." But okay, I'm gonna try again. Let's go to the chat. So Adam asked that. So in this case, Floof discussed that you need glucose and fructose to optimize the total amount of carbohydrates that you can ingest per minute. He asked, is that still useful? So if you consume less than 60 grams per minute, do you still have benefits from a mixture, or can you then just take glucose on its own?
Well, I never thought about that, but if I just, I think if you are under the maximum that you can uptake for glucose, then there's no point in needing to add fructose as well, because you're already like, it's not going to, how do I say this? Let's say like you have, you need 1 gram per minute to reach your cap, and you're only getting 0.5 gram per minute. Then it doesn't matter if it's 0.25 fructose, 0.25 glucose. It can just be 0.5 gram of whatever, right?
Yeah. So that's theoretically correct, and it's also in practice correct. There have been studies done like that, and they very clearly show that it doesn't matter. So only once you get above that 1 gram of glucose, and you can no longer take up more glucose, then you're better off by switching everything above that to fructose. And Adam had another question. Let's see, what was it? Oh yeah, he asked if we can discuss high molecular carbohydrates. Any one of you familiar with this?
High molecular carbohydrates? You mean like rice and stuff, like
complex
starch?
carbs, or
No. So within the category still sugars, you can have higher molecular carbohydrates, like cyclic dextrin, for example, is one. And the idea is because they have a higher molecular weight, they're hypotonic, and there's some data suggesting that increase gastric emptying. And well, to summarize, I don't think they're very useful, but now let me explain how I arrive at that conclusion. The main reason is because I never hear anyone in the field about them, which means there's just not a lot of people who've discovered positive things about them. Otherwise, they would be talking about it every chance they have. I know there is at least one study that shows that the same amount of carbohydrates in a high molecular form versus just straight glucose improved glycogen rates, suggesting like, oh, maybe they have some benefit. But in that study, a suboptimal amount of carbohydrate was used to begin with. There's also a study that has given then the high molecular carbohydrates versus glucose during exercise. But in that study, an optimal amount of carbohydrates was given, and there they found no benefit whatsoever. So I think this is one of those things again where maybe it's useful when you haven't reached the optimal amount of carbohydrates, which could make sense. If you have faster gastric emptying, well, that's a benefit. But once you've hit the optimal amount of carbohydrates, the uptake in the stomach again is the limiting factor. So even if it goes faster to your stomach, if your GI tract is the limiting factor, it's not going to help anything. But those two studies are the only one I'm familiar with. So one positive, one not positive. But the one that's not positive is the one during optimal conditions. So I value that one a little bit more. And then combined with the fact that other than that, have never heard anyone about it, makes me skeptical that they have a whole lot of application. That's pretty much all I know about the topic. Let's see here. Okay, I'm gonna read this out loud. I think this is our former intern Francesca. If so, hi Francesca. Hey guys, given that sport drinks are not always necessary for physical performance per se, are there studies looking into sports, simple carbs based, and cognitive performance / decision making during sports?
Yes, that's a good question. And there are some studies that give carbs during exercise and look at skills. And it seems to be that also there it can be useful or beneficial, but it also of course depends on how much you already have in the body and how fatigued you are, etc. Because for example, I think if you look at fatigue with exercise, you can be centrally fatigued and peripherally fatigued. So peripherally is more into the muscles. So for example, you run out of your glycogen stores there, so you don't have the fuel. And also in the brain, you also need to have enough glucose to be able to think, to make decisions, to have like for your skills in general, because of course everything comes from your brain towards your muscle to tell your muscle basically what they should do. And if you get fatigued there, you can also decrease your performance. And then studies have shown, and it's not as well researched as like really looking peripherally with fatigue, for example, but there are like quite some indications that if you give carbohydrates during exercise, that you can also at least maintain your skill decisions, etc. And so basically it can be useful for in that regard. And if it is Francesca, I would also say hi to Francesca. So
yes,
it's good to hear from you again.
It's her. She confirmed in the chat. So within this topic, I only know of one study where carbohydrate supplementation during basically soccer skills, like they just put it like, let's call it a soccer training with all kinds of soccer skills. People were just faster at doing all the necessary skills. Like they had to just dribble with a ball, certain routines, and then pass the ball. So there is some suggestion that carbohydrates can also be beneficial for like skill sports, which are not as simple as just, can my muscle keep working? No, you actually need to coordinate your muscles.
Yeah, what I also think is interesting in that regard, I mean, now I may go quite deep, but your brain can use, of course, the ketone bodies. We know if you're like in a ketogenic diet and your brain uses that, but it can also use, of course, the glucose and lactate. So both are very good fuel sources for the brain. And studies have shown that if it can has sufficient glucose and lactate available, and indeed can also perform optimally there. And if you go back to this glucose fructose situation, we also know with fructose it will be converted in the liver first to either glucose or lactate. And maybe I go too much into depth now, but I think that's also interesting to see, like, if you can also increase your lactate levels as well, that can also be used by the brain, and also in that way may be useful as a fuel source and help your brain in whatever it needs to do, decision making and stuff.
Yeah, so to quickly add onto that, so for some people this might sound very shocking, because lactate and lactic acid, we have always been taught like, oh no, that's causing that burning feeling. That's just incorrect. It's quite the opposite. Lactate is actually a useful fuel source in your body. Let's not get into it anymore. But if there's one thing to take away, lactate is not a bad thing. Maybe one thing that I had to think of when you said central versus peripheral fatigue costs is what I find quite interesting. Oh, this actually gets back to what we discussed earlier with, if you stop now, the pain is over. I am very aware of that. Apparently not everyone is, but science actually shows that everyone thinks like that subconsciously. Because you have studies where people, for example, they get instructed to do as many reps as possible on a leg extension. And then for every rep they can do, they get like $10. So they have an incentive to do as many reps as they can. And then they're like, sorry, can't do it. I wish I could. And then they put electrodes on the muscle. And then the muscle contracts and they can do another 2 repetitions extra, which show that the energy systems in the muscle are not the limiting factor. Something in your brain is telling me, no, just stop. Either maybe it's pain or just fatigue or subconscious fear for injury, but the muscle could theoretically and practically continue. So that's
So theoretically, maybe psychopaths would be the best at training because they wouldn't have that.
Well, you could argue that every elite athlete is a psychopath, like by normal people's standards, right? Like,
yeah.
But you also have like the expression like obsessed is a word made up by the lazy or something. Like it's all like when if you train 20 hours, is that healthy? Is that like admirable? Is that crazy? Is that
Is it an addiction at that point?
Yeah. I don't know. Like if you win world championships with it. It's difficult to call it an addiction, but I don't know. Okay, guys, I think it's about time to wrap it up. Time to load some carbohydrates, refuel our brain glycogen. You guys, any shout outs you want to do to your mom, your aunt, to the chat? Any wise remarks?
So AA is the best.
Perfect.
Wait, what? What did you say?
A drink. AA.
Oh, drink.
Milan, we know you would disagree.
Yes.
You would go with your gay ass. Yep, Salon de coiffeur.
During a marathon.
We can order that one next Friday, Milan.
Maybe we should just maybe we should set like once we hit this many podcasts, we should just do a podcast about a kapsalon. We all eat one live so chat can really see how it looks next to your head. We analyze the nutrient profile, and then Milan has something to look out for. Okay, guys, thanks again. We'll do one soon. Probably not, but we'll do one soon. And I'll see you in the next one.
Ciao, ciao.